is Focus with Jack Cottle.
Good evening, I'm Jack Cottle. Welcome to this month's edition of Focus. This month we're talking about the Sanford Lab in Leiden. Update on what's going on there these days, what's going to be happening in the future. Three guests with us to talk about that. Mike Headley is the Sanford Lab Executive Director. Jared Heiss is the Sanford Lab Science Director. And Juna Paza is the Sanford Lab Education and Outreach Director. And it is officially the Sanford Underground Research Facility. After more than 125 years as the Homestake Mine and Lead the Gold Mine shut down in 2002. The property transitioned into a research facility back in 2006. Physics experiments were going on long before that, though, with Dr. Ray Davis getting started back in the 60s, eventually being awarded a Nobel Prize for his work. Barrett Gold donated the property to the state with money from T. Denny Sanford and the state. The lab became a reality. And Mike Headley, we're going to start to you. I guess, where does the lab sit these days?
Well, we've been operating physics experiments underground since 2012, and we've actually had one of the first experiments that we started actually completed. It was a dark matter experiment, and with a world-leading result. So we already have some great results under our belt so far. We have a neutrino experiment that's operating underground called the Myrana Demonstrator Experiment, and we're gearing up for new experiments that are coming. We have next generation dark matter experiment. I'm sure Jarrett will talk more about neutrinos and dark matter over the next few minutes, but next generation dark matter experiment, which will be one of the leading experiments in the world, has now started to install on the surface. Will be going underground about a year from now. And we're getting ready to kick off construction of what really will be one of the largest science experiments ever attempted here on U.S. soil. It will be a neutrino experiment that we'll be working on with Fermilab out of Chicago, one of the 17 U.S. national labs here in the country. And so the game plan for this experiment will be to shoot a beam of neutrinos from Fermilab at us out here in South Dakota and really try and unlock some of the mysteries of the universe that we think neutrinos might be help us to sort out.
From a science perspective, is this lab developing the way you guys envisioned it would over time?
Well, I think if we look back to some of the early days when the NSF was planning to fund a fairly large build-out, certainly we've changed course since then, where the space and so forth that's being built out and the infrastructure is really more experiment specific, so each experiment is building what they need. But we're still here, we're still moving forward. We've got, as I just mentioned, one of the world's leading experiments that will be coming to our site, and this experiment, the last one I mentioned, this neutrino experiment, it's called the Deep Underground Neutrino Experiment. And the facility portion of that is called LBNF, or the Long Baseline Neutrino Facility. Already has over 1,100 scientists that are a part of the collaboration, so really global in scale. 176 institutions that are involved from 32 different nations. So it's really international from the start, and putting what we're doing here in South Dakota really on the world stage.
Now, Jared Heiss is the science director up there at the Sanford Lab. Jared, for people not really familiar with the lab, why are you guys doing all of this a mile underground as opposed to on the surface?
Good question. If you stand on the surface of the Earth, we're being constantly bombarded by a rain of cosmic radiation. Hold out your hand. 3 of these cosmic rays are going through every second. And if you're a physics experiment looking for a rare process that in some cases no one's ever seen before, you need to give yourself every advantage. And so that's what these experiments are doing by moving underground. They reduce that noise or that cosmic ray shower by about a factor of 10 million. So rather than 3 a second on the surface, moving underground to the 4,850 foot level of our facility allows them to look at maybe 1 per month as opposed to that 3 per second. And so for groups looking for rare decays of neutrinos or decays that would implicate properties of neutrinos, looking for evidence of dark matter, those searches are so exquisite that they have to reduce background in every way, shape, or form. This mile of rock is one component of that. They also have to optimize the design of their experiment, choosing very low radioactivity components. And in fact, even the facility underground, some of those materials were chosen to be as low in radioactivity as possible.
Now, a lot of talk at the lab about neutrinos and dark matter. Is there a simple, easy way to explain what those are and what you're looking for?
I'll try. Neutrinos are fundamental particles. They're like electrons. They're like quarks. We don't think we can break them up. they're given off in nuclear reactions. So the sun, for instance, thermonuclear fusion going inside the sun produces gobs of neutrinos. So I mentioned 3 cosmic rays going through your hand every second. There are trillions of neutrinos from our sun going through your hand every second, to put that scale in perspective. But they interact so rarely, you might only have 1 neutrino interact in your body throughout your whole lifetime. So it's hard to wrap your mind around how weak that interaction is. Dark matter is in the same sort of category in the fact that it interacts very weakly. In fact, it interacts at most as weakly as the neutrino, and maybe even less strongly than that. We think the dark matter is responsible for the rotation speed of our galaxy. We can't explain the high velocity that we see in terms of the rotation. We also look out into the cosmos and see light bending around objects we can't see. That implicates some matter that we call dark, mostly because we don't know much about it. But when we look at the evolution of the universe, there is a component that dark matter would help explain, and that's why we think it really is there to be seen, and we have experiments underground at our facility that are leading the way.
Why does that matter to the average guy? I mean, what difference does that make in their life?
That's another good question. There are a couple different answers to that. If you ask the scientist, understanding how the universe works is what drives them. That's what gets them out of bed in the morning. But there are a number of reasons why basic research is important for everyone. And that can run the gamut from, say, medical imaging. Some of the technologies that are developed in nuclear and particle physics now are everyday apparatus for looking and helping to diagnose medical conditions, MRIs, CAT scans. All those came out of the nuclear science industry. We're also training young scientists, highly qualified personnel who can think critically, who can do some of these hard experiments. And so from the state of South Dakota and from T. Denny Sanford's perspective, having this facility, keeping our best and brightest in South Dakota, training them on the techniques and giving them an opportunity to participate in world-leading science is a good reason why people should care, I think.
June Paz is the Education and Outreach Director. June, what's the community component of all of this? How does this tie in with the community here in the Black Hills?
Well, the mission of the Education and Outreach Department, particularly the Education Department, is to translate that complex and sophisticated science so it's accessible for more people. So what does a neutrino look like, or dark matter look like, or what does it look like if a kindergartner or a first grader or a second grader is trying to wrap their head around it? And more importantly, what does it look like for those young students to really understand what science is and to be able to put themselves in the role of a scientist? We want to develop that curiosity about the universe and about what's happening in our world, and we want them to understand that what's happening up at Sanford Lab in their very backyard is really world-class important science that someday they're going to hear really great things about, and we want them to be in on the ground floor of that information.
Mike, how important in the whole mission of what you guys have set up with the Sanford Lab is that community and education part of all of this?
It's an essential part of our mission. And if you go back to, you talked about the Denny Sanford gift, the work or the kind of the vision that Denny painted back when that gift was given, and discussions with then Governor Mike Rounds, education and outreach was a central part of the mission. And really not just having this world-class science come here and being able to interact with the scientists and having that work done here, but sharing it with our kids and really being able to advance the education programs and how we're teaching science and math here in the state. So that's really been an essential part of our mission from day one. And as June talked about, we're continuing to push that forward and share that with kids in the state and the region.
Now, Jerry, you were talking a little bit ago about college students. What kind of opportunity is that for them, the physics students, to get involved in something at this level?
Sure. Well, the lab, in many ways, has helped bootstrap the PhD physics program within the state. So the regential universities throughout South Dakota have built up their physics programs trying to leverage the science that we're doing at our facility. That includes School of Mines, USD, Black Hill State, and others. And so with that program in place, and the increased number of faculty, they can bring on a larger number of students and postdocs, and we're seeing that already at the laboratory, where different universities are able to play a bigger role because they have a larger critical mass, they have a larger workforce that can do some of the bigger projects. That's true on the Myrona Demonstrator Project. The School of Mines and Black Hills State University are involved in that. The LZ dark matter experiment, the next generation of LUX that has finished up. There are very important contributions from local universities there as well. And the faculty and students are playing a big role in those experiments.
All right, we got to take a break. We'll continue our look at the Sanford Lab when we come back with this month's edition of Focus. And I'm Jack Cottle. Welcome back to this month's edition of Focus. This month we're talking about the Sanford Lab and LEAD. Jared Heiss is here, is the Sanford Lab Science Director. You said experiments have been going on for quite a while now. What have you guys learned? What have you discovered so far?
Yes, we talked a little bit earlier on about the LUX dark matter experiment that wrapped up. They were the most sensitive dark matter experiment anywhere in the world. They didn't find dark matter, which is why we're still looking for it with the LZ experiment, but they found nothing better than anyone else has done previously. And that may be a sort of a cute way of saying it, but the techniques and the detector technology that they developed for that experiment are now being translated into the next generation LZ that will be at our facility. The Myrona Demonstrator Project is a world leader in ultra pure materials. They've electroformed copper. And that was one of the core components of their experiment, using germanium detectors looking for a rare form of decay involving germanium and implicating properties of neutrinos. So that technology will likely be a part of the next generation that's scaled up from about 50 kilograms of germanium. The next step will be 200 kilograms on their way to 1,000 kilograms. So both of those two experiments on dark matter and neutrino properties are guiding the path forward.
Any of the future experiments, the ones that are coming, that you're particularly excited about?
They're all pretty exciting. The LZ experiment, of course, next generation dark matter will probe pretty much all of the parameter space where we think dark matter might be and where it's relatively easy to find. LZ, if dark matter is there, LZ will find it. The Myrona Demonstrator Project and future experiments will hopefully find properties of the neutrinos, talking a little bit about the mass of the neutrino. We don't understand why it's as light as it is, and we don't understand the mass difference between some of those neutrinos. So that'll be an important component. And then, of course, the LBNF Dune experiment, really nailing in the precision properties of some of the neutrino oscillation parameters. That's really exciting as well.
Now, Juna Paza is the Education and Outreach Director. One of your jobs is to bring this information, this research out to the masses. How challenging is that to bring that so people can understand what's going on?
There's definitely a challenge. It's a challenge for us as educators to try to understand the science. But I think the most important thing about the challenge is to try to figure out what it is in the science that's going on that's important to teachers in the classroom. What is the science that they need to teach, and how does the science that we're doing at Sanford Lab relate to the science that teachers need to teach? So finding that connection between what's already going on in education and the science that we're doing at Sanford Lab, so we can convince teachers that they want to use our educational materials, that these educational units are applicable to the teachers, to the students in their classrooms.
Now Mike Headley is the Sanford Lab Executive Director. This obviously is not inexpensive research and work and excavation and all that goes on. So funding, a huge part of what you're doing. How are you guys sitting for funding now? Where do all of those sit with the NSF and other groups that are funding?
Well, our funding is primarily from the Department of Energy, and so they fund our operations. We're under subcontract to Fermilab, which is one of the national laboratories in the U.S., and so our current operational funding is about $15 million per year, and that pays for the day-to-day activities, making sure that we can keep the experiments operating safely, and making sure that they're adhering to our safety rules and maintaining the overall infrastructure. So we talked about some of these future experiments that are coming. They have been getting strong support, strong funding support on the Hill. Our congressional delegation has just been wonderful. I mean, they understand the value of this science to the nation and the world, and the benefits to our state. And so our delegation has been great. We talked about the LBNF Dune experiment, this experiment with Fermilab, And in the current fiscal year, in fiscal year 18, they received $95 million to really be able to help kickstart construction. And so the current, I'll say, draft forms of the budget for FY19 include about $145 million. So we're now seeing, as the project starts to ramp up towards construction starting this November, we're seeing the funding increase in a kind of a commensurate path to be able to get activities going. And as you point out, underground excavation is it's not a cheap enterprise, but we've had, as I mentioned, just great support from Congress, and we're very thankful for that and for our delegation support moving forward.
Has funding and direction for that evolved and changed along the way? Have you guys had to evolve and change with it?
It has. You know, if you look back at the appropriations bills when we first started and the NSF decided they were not going to move forward and the Department of Energy stepped forward, the language really had kind of a keep the place alive to accomplish the experiments that we were doing at that time. And it's really transitioned into more, this is going to be the underground laboratory for the U.S. It may not be officially called a national laboratory, but it's really going to be expected to operate like that and really support experiments for the nation right here deep underground.
Now, it's a lot of money coming into the community. June, as far as outreach in the community, what impact has that had here in the Black Hills?
Well, since 2015, when we really started tracking a more formal education program, we've personally touched about 30,000 students in the state of South Dakota. So we have curriculum units, assembly programs, and field trips, and when you add all of the students that we've impacted through those 3 items, plus some career fairs and a few other things, our number is over 30,000 students. Most of those students are in the state of South Dakota. We cover the entire state. We spend a lot of time traveling and carrying equipment and curriculum kits around the state. We ship them to any school in the state that wants to use our materials, and so we're trying hard to be sure that we provide a service to the state of South Dakota that supports our efforts.
All right. Jared, now looking at this, you said this earlier talking, you said this has, in the science community, has become a very well-known operation that you guys have. How much inquiries do you get from scientists around the world saying, I'd like to do something there. I would like to have an experiment to run down there. How much of that do you get?
So we've talked about some of the main experiments so far, but we have 24 active experiments at our facility, and they run through the various disciplines that we support. So that's biology, geology, engineering, and of course physics. So 24 amongst those different disciplines. There are a number of groups that have expressed interest, and some of them are reaching out for a support letter, going after funding, say from the NSF or from the Department of Energy, contacting us, telling us a little bit about what they want to do, and having us lend them support so they can get that funding. That's not always a guarantee, but that's the path that happens, and we have received quite a few letters asking for that support so they can do their science at our facility. We have a lot of the main experiments that we talked about already. I didn't talk about one other group called Casper. It's an accelerator funded by the NSF, and so there's different funding paths there as well. They're also underground at our facility, studying how stars work. So complementary to the evolution of the universe, we're trying to understand how stars work, and ultimately some of that even gets back to how neutrinos are produced. But there is a lot of interest, absolutely.
All right, we got to take another break, and we'll finish up our look at the Sanford Lab when we come back with this month's edition of Focus. And I'm Jack Cottle. Welcome back to this month's edition of Focus, talking about the Sanford Lab in Lead. And Juna Pazes, the Sanford Lab Education and Outreach Director, you had mentioned there are some unique opportunities for students to get involved in this.
Absolutely. For undergraduate students, we talked a little bit about undergraduates earlier. We have a Davis Bacall Scholar Program, which is a 4 to 5 week program, experiential program for students. They spend a week at Sanford Lab, week or 10 days at Sanford Lab, and then they get in a van and travel all around the Midwest, and they go to businesses and industries and to other national labs and learn a lot about what's going on with science and experiments all around the country. And after they've spent 10 or 15 days on the road, they end up in Chicago at Fermilab. And after they visit Fermilab, they get on an airplane and go to Italy and visit Gran Sasso. So it's a wonderful, totally supported experience. We take 8 students every single year. The students have to be 18 years old because they spend some time underground. And they're students who are either just finishing high school or students between their freshman and sophomore year. So it's a really narrow group of students who may apply for the program, and the applications open in early November, and the students are selected in January. So I just want to make sure that students are aware that that opportunity is available. Also, every summer, Sanford Lab hires interns for most of the entire summer, and they can work with a scientist, or they might work with an engineer, or they might work in the communication department and learn how to do some writing or some communication. But those internships are it's a really unique experience for students to have a chance to sit beside someone, a professional in their field, and see what it would look like to actually do that position.
All right. Mike Hedley is the executive director of the Sanford Lab. We talked about the science, we talked about the education. What about the economic impact? How big of an impact does that have around this area, or will it have down the road?
Sure, the economic impact is really a strong story with the lab being here in the state. Through the end of last federal fiscal year, the end of September is when we kind of did the last official accounting, and at that point, with all the sources of funding that have contributed to lab operations and development, there's been roughly $185 million that's been spent in the state. So I'm sure as we go through that process again this year, we'll find that we're in excess of $200 million supporting the economy right here in the state. We have approximately 125 employees with the South Dakota Science and Technology Authority that are living here, working here. A number of them have come back, people who grew up here. We have a lot of examples of people who grew up here, went away to the coast or whatever to do work, and have now come back and have the possibility of great paying technical jobs right here in the state. We talked about the experiment coming up with Fermilab, this neutrino experiment, and Fermilab did a economic impact study of that. And so for activities here in the western region of South Dakota, we're expecting roughly $1 billion of economic output from that, not only the construction, but through its operations over about a 20-year period. And about 2,000 jobs, not just 2,000 at our facility, but 2,000 jobs throughout the region that would be positively impacted by that activity. So I think the story for not only the education impact, but also the economic impact here for the lab has been really tremendous.
Now, Jared Heiss is the science director at the Sanford Lab. Jared, how exciting is it for you to be able to collaborate on a regular basis with some of the top minds in the world in your field of physics? How exciting is that for you?
It's thrilling. It really is. You have world-leading scientists from institutions across the U.S., from Europe, from all over the world, really, coming to focus their intellectual capabilities and capacities on finding neutrino properties, finding dark matter, these types of things. So it really is my dream job. You can ask my wife. It's absolutely true. But it's fantastic. They come in, different people for maybe a couple weeks at a time or a month at a time, focus on maybe their specialty or what the detector needs for that particular period. And you just go and talk to them. Hey, what's going on? Tell me a little bit about this, and you learn so much from them. It's fabulous.
I mean, how much you guys just pick each other's brain about, hey, I got an idea that, are there?
Yep, there's lots of, that's how science is done. You scratch your head and you get people together and you come up with creative solutions to solve problems.
Where do you see this all going from here? Do you see this 10 years from now, 20 years from now? What's the vision of where it evolves to from here?
I think it's going to be here decades from now. We talk about the experiment with Fermilab, and we've done a lot about that during the segment today. And really that experiment, we joke a bit that will be the Macy's of our mall. So we're expecting that experiment, both the facility construction and the outfitting.
I got to cut you off. I apologize. We got started when we didn't have time to finish. That'll do it for us for this month's edition of Focus. I want to thank Mike Hedley, Jared Heiss, and Juna Paza. See you again next month.